They were surrounded by German forces, cut off from food, ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements. But on top of Hill 314, two American artillery observers had something the Germans desperately needed to take away: a clear view of the battlefield and a radio. As long as that radio kept working, the hill was never truly cut off. August 7, 1944, the Allies had broken out of Normandy, but Germany launched a major counterattack at Mortain in an attempt to halt the Allied advance. Hitler ordered a major counterattack near the town of Mortain. The operation was called Lüttich. German armored formations pushed toward Avranches, hoping to disrupt the Allied advance and sever the route through the town. If the attack succeeded, the German command hoped it could disrupt the entire Allied advance. But standing directly in the path of that offensive was a position known to the Americans as Hill 314. The number referred to the hill's elevation, 314 meters above sea level. The hill overlooked the surrounding countryside. From its summit, observers could see roads and approaches for miles. For an artillery-forward observer, it was almost the perfect position. And that was exactly why it became so important. Around 700 American soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, were on the hill when the German attack began. Soon, they were surrounded. The battalion command post in Mortain was overrun, leaving several companies of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, isolated on Hill 314. Then the German attacks began. The Americans had forward observers from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion supporting the defense. One team included 1st Lieutenant Charles A. Barts. The other included 2nd Lieutenant Robert L. Weiss. Their job was simple to describe, but incredibly dangerous to perform. They observed German movements and radio target information to American artillery batteries supporting the defense. The observers had already registered important targets and likely avenues of approach. That meant when German troops began moving, the observers could quickly request artillery fire. And because Hill 314 offered such a commanding view, Weiss and the other observers could see German movements that were difficult for the surrounded infantrymen to observe from their defensive positions. The radio became their connection to the outside world. German troops could surround the hill. They could attack its perimeter. They could cut off supplies. But as long as the radios kept working, the Americans could still call for artillery support from batteries farther behind the American lines, and the artillery could reach the battlefield. The Germans repeatedly attacked Hill 314. The American defenders were exhausted. Their ammunition was running low. Food and medical supplies were becoming scarce. Radio batteries were also becoming a serious problem. Yet the position continued to hold. German forces understood the importance of the hill. If they captured it, they would gain a valuable observation position over the surrounding area. So, the attacks continued. The Americans responded with artillery, again and again. The situation became so desperate that attempts were made to resupply the isolated troops by air. But the American position was small and surrounded by German forces. Some supplies landed outside the perimeter. Others were lost. The defenders were becoming weaker by the hour. Still, they refused to surrender, and the forward observers kept doing their job. Robert Weiss and Charles Barts continued directing artillery fire against German movements around the hill. Their radios connected the isolated infantrymen to powerful artillery batteries farther away. The hill had effectively become an observation post from which the Americans could influence the wider battlefield. The Germans were not simply attacking a group of infantrymen. They were attacking a position that could call down artillery whenever the observers identified a worthwhile target. That made every German movement dangerous. Every road became a potential target. Every concentration of troops could be reported. Every attack had to cross terrain watched by American observers. And the men on Hill 314 were paying an enormous price for maintaining that advantage. For days, they remained isolated. They fought through repeated German attacks while desperately trying to conserve ammunition and supplies. Some wounded soldiers could not be evacuated. Others depended on whatever medical supplies remained inside the perimeter. The situation became so desperate that the Americans even experimented with firing supplies toward the isolated position using artillery. But the hill continued to hold. For 6 days, the isolated Americans held their position against repeated German attacks. The Germans had failed to eliminate the American position. And something even more important was happening elsewhere. The German offensive was losing momentum. Allied forces were receiving reinforcements. Allied ground attack aircraft were also striking German tanks, vehicles, and infantry around Mortain. German tanks and vehicles were suffering from artillery and air attacks, and the German advance toward Avranches was failing to achieve its objective. Hill 314 had not single-handedly stopped the German offensive. No single unit died. But the men holding that hill had played an important role in preventing German forces from gaining control of the high ground. On August 12, the isolated American position was finally relieved. The men who emerged from Hill 314 were exhausted. They had endured days of combat with dwindling supplies and heavy casualties. But they had accomplished something remarkable. They had held a position the Germans desperately wanted. And throughout the battle, artillery observers such as Robert Weiss had helped turn that hilltop into a powerful observation point. The story of Hill 314 isn't really about one man. It is about a group of soldiers who refused to surrender. 2 forward observers who kept their radios working, and artillery crews far behind the lines who answered their calls. Robert Weiss wasn't alone. Charles Barts was there. Frank Denius and other artillery personnel were there. Hundreds of infantrymen were there. And artillery batteries farther behind the lines were ready to respond. That's what made Hill 314 so important. The radio didn't fire the artillery. Neither officer was fighting the German army alone. But the connection between the observer and the guns transformed what a small, isolated force could accomplish. A soldier on a hill could see. A radio could communicate. And artillery far away could respond. Throughout the battle, that system helped keep Hill 314 in American hands. By the end of the Battle of Mortain, Hitler's counteroffensive had failed. The German forces had not cut the Allied armies in two. They had not reached Avranches, and the Allied advance continued. Within days, German forces would become trapped in the Falaise pocket as Allied armies closed in around them. German control of France was rapidly collapsing, and Hill 314 became one of the many places where American soldiers had stood their ground when the outcome was still uncertain. Robert Weiss survived the war, but the story he helped create on that hill became part of a much larger lesson. Modern warfare isn't always decided by the biggest tank, the largest army, or the most powerful weapon. Sometimes it comes down to information. Someone has to see the enemy. Someone has to communicate what they see. And someone has to be ready to respond. On Hill 314 in August 1944, a handful of forward observers did exactly that. They were surrounded. They were running out of supplies. They couldn't call for a rescue force to immediately reach them, but they still had their radios. And as long as those radios worked, the hill was never truly alone. One hill, 2 forward observers, hundreds of surrounded soldiers, and an artillery network waiting behind the American lines. That was enough to help hold Hill 314 until American forces finally reached them.